I interviewed my grandpa about the meaning of the soldiers after the war. When I asked him how the soldiers were treated after the war, this is what he responded with.
Oh, they were spit upon and called baby killers and just everything under the sun. They were treated very, very poorly, from not only from the hippie liberals that were running around, but also from our government.
It's been 36 years since the last combat units came off the line and came home.
When I landed at the San Francisco airport, I was spit on. I was called a baby killer.
Well, it hurt everybody's feelings.
People were against the war, so they were against us, basically.
And I couldn't never understand that.
So I went in the men's room, took off my uniform, threw it in a garbage can, and put on civilian clothes to wear the rest of the way home.
And all we were doing is a job that we were asked to do.
We don't hold it against American people.
I was not one of these guys that wore fatigues or wore t-shirts or anything like that after Vietnam. I just figured that was a chapter in my life that was over.
In the things they carried, Norman Bowker was one example of how the soldiers were treated at the end of the war. When he arrived home from the war, he drove his father's Chevy on the 7-mile loop around the lake many times to get his mind off of the war. After 3 years of being home, he committed suicide because he thought that he had no point in life. He wrote a letter to Tim O'Brien, which told Tim about how he felt worthless after the war. He tried to work, but he couldn't keep a job for very long, so he had to live with his parents. He couldn't find any meaning in life after he returned. The government and people around him, other than his parents, didn't know what he was going through, and they didn't try to help him get over his experience after the war. 4 years after the first withdrawal of a U.S. battalion, the last U.S. combat troops eventually left South Vietnam on March 29, 1973. In total, there were around 2.5 million Americans served in the Vietnam War. They were not only soldiers, but also officers, advisors, nurses, doctors, and other units that supported the Republic of Vietnam. American soldiers came home, but the effects of the war were still carried on their shoulders. When the American soldiers returned from the World War II, they were greeted as heroes. Parades were held everywhere to honor their sacrifices. Unfortunately, though honor seemed a luxury to the Vietnam veterans, they were mistreated. Some veterans recalled that when they had landed, people were demonstrating against them. Many spit on us and called us rude names. American society was divided by the Vietnam War, as its people were full of doubt about its righteousness. Also, Vietnam, as opposed to the World War II, was a deeply unpopular war. American public, as a result, tried their best to forget about it and tended to forget its veterans as well. Although most of the veterans succeeded in making the transition into civilian life, many did not. About 150,000 came home wounded or amputated, while at least 21,000 were permanently disabled and unable to work for the rest of their lives. Even worse, they did not receive proper and necessary help. The majority of Vietnam veterans came from low-income, working-class households. They could not even afford private health care services, thereby having no choice but to be treated in dirty public hospitals. Many veterans returned home not only with physical pains, but also with psychological problems. They still experienced depression, flashbacks, nightmares, loneliness, and inability to get close to others. Those mental problems that many veterans suffered were named as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. According to a study, almost 700,000 Vietnam veterans returned home with PTSD. However, the Veterans Administration did not recognize its existence until 1979. Overall, I think researching this topic has shown me that our veterans were not treated like they should have been. I think that people were mad about us being in the war and not mad at the actual people fighting the war. They were more mad at the government than the soldiers.